She clerked for Chief Justice Leo Strine, I read, at the Delaware Supreme Court. So that probably meant you were predestined for a career in corporate law. And she also worked for some time. She practiced corporate law for some time at Sullivan and Cromwell. So thanks very much, Dorothy, for being here tonight and presenting your interesting paper. This is The Corporate Governance Machine. This is co-authored with Elizabeth Pollman, and I believe Elizabeth is also in the audience. So a very warm welcome to you, Elizabeth, as well. Great to have you here as well. I just very quickly, before I hand over to you, Dorothy, I very quickly introduce our commentators as well, so that I don't have to interrupt the comments afterwards. So we have two fantastic commentators. The first one is Sue Konzelmann. She is a reader in the Department of Management at Birkbeck College, University of London. She has also written widely on issues in corporate governance, stakeholder relations. So she's, I think, perfectly placed to comment on this, on Dorothy's paper. She's written so from the perspective of economics. She holds a PhD and MA and BA, I think, in economics from the University of Notre Dame in the United States and Trinity Washington University, also in the United States. And I should just mention, recently she's published a very interesting book, and I think very well received book on austerity, the economics of austerity, 2019, and published by CUP. So that I think is also noteworthy. And Georg Ringe is our second discussant, our legal discussant. He's professor of law and finance at the University of Hamburg, where he is also director of the Institute of Law and Economics. And he's, in addition, I think it's called a permanent visiting professor at University of Oxford. That's at least what I read on your website. And he holds numerous other visiting positions. There's not sufficient time, I think, to list all of that. Suffice it to say that he's an internationally leading expert on comparative corporate law and corporate governance. So great to have all of you here. And now, without further ado, over to you, Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Carsten, for that introduction and the warm welcome, and to Georg and Sue for being here to share your commentary. It's great to be here. And so I'm excited to be talking about the corporate governance machine. It's a paper about the past, present, and future of corporate governance in the United States. And our bottom line here is we show that corporate governance, at least in the United States, has become something more than a neutral set of procedures and processes. It's become a system that's composed of multiple legal and institutional players. And so this is what we call the corporate governance machine. And as we've seen this evolution take place, the machine has developed this strong slant towards prioritizing one set of corporate stakeholders, which is the shareholders, above everybody else. So this, of course, has implications for the contemporary debate about corporate purpose, which has generated a lot of attention and headlines. It also has implications for other pressing debates in corporate law. So I'll touch on all of this today. But let's begin with the beginning, the past. And in particular, I want to talk about the origins and the evolution of the term corporate governance. And to preview, as we've seen, as the concept of corporate governance crystallized and really rose in prominence, it took on a particular meaning of promoting shareholder welfare that wasn't there, that wasn't really part of its original meaning. So at the beginning, in the early 60s, we see corporate governance used for the first time by a business ethicist, this guy, Richard Eales, who is arguing for a well-tempered corporation that would serve society. And about a decade later, in 1972, the term first appeared in the New York Times in the midst of a series of corporate scandals, and it again was being used in a different way. It stemmed from an analogy between the government and the corporation, and it suggested that we could get limitations on corporate misconduct through internal checks and balances. So there was a connotation of accountability, but not accountability to shareholders. It was this idea of keeping the corporation focused on being a good citizen for society's benefit. So shortly thereafter, we get economists injecting this concept of agency costs into these discussions. And in particular, Michael Jensen and William Meckling wrote in their famous 1976 article that the relationship between stockholders and management fits this definition of a pure agency relationship. So in their vision, the divergence of interests between shareholders and managers become agency costs. And the principal agent model provides this really simple, sticky idea that had been lacking in conversations about, the theory of the firm and its role in society. And so from there, we see this normative development taking place, where we get this sense that some governance is good and some is bad, and the good governance is encompassing things that minimize agency costs between management, the agents, and their principals, the shareholders. So as corporate governance becomes this mainstream term and concept, it's immediately given this directional meaning. It's all about serving shareholder interests and minimizing agency costs. So what follows is the deal decade of the 80s. This really locked in this meaning and also propelled it. So by the end of that decade, shareholder wealth maximization has moved into the corporate governance mainstream. It's changed the way that corporate boards and management think about their jobs. And we also see critical perspectives being relegated to the fringe. So, they're being called progressive corporate law or stakeholderism, outside of this sort of mainstream concept of what corporate governance is. Okay, so to summarize, corporate governance was initially thought to be a tool that would constrain corporate power for the benefit of the public. It develops to embody this particular view of the corporation with shareholders paramount and directors serving as their agents. And this intellectual legacy lies at the foundation of the contemporary corporate governance system in the United States. And this is what we call the corporate governance machine. So now let's talk about this machine, its components. And so the machine has three reinforcing components: law, culture, and markets. And I know most of this is going to be familiar to you. I'm not going to go over each of these and how they orient each subcomponent. But I'll just give a brief overview of some of this. So starting with law, this is where most conversations about corporate governance begin and then end. And in the category of law, we have not just Delaware, which is the 800-pound gorilla of state corporate law, but also Congress, the SEC, and the Department of Labor. And so each of these government actors focus management on shareholder interests in a variety of ways. Again, I'm not going to describe all of these. I'll just highlight an interesting recent example from the DOL. So the DOL is the federal agency with regulatory oversight over retirement accounts in the United States. And it imposes a fiduciary duty on investment advisors that invest pension fund assets. And it recently finalized a rule that prohibits these advisors from selecting plan assets based on non-financial objectives. And the goal here was to target ESG investment vehicles. And so, according to this new guidance from the DOL, if you are an ERISA fiduciary, you're managing retirement assets, you have no discretion to consider shareholder value more broadly. You can't think about whether an investment would be consistent with an investor's values. You have to focus solely on wealth maximization. So you can see through this example how government policy influences how retirement assets are invested and how corresponding governance rights are exercised. And in this example, it's very clear that the orientation or the nudge from the federal government is pushing in the direction of this traditional shareholder wealth maximization direction. Okay, so markets is the next category here, and this encompasses all of the institutional players who participate in this market for corporate governance. And I think some people don't recognize how influential these players are. I just recently had a conversation with a student in the context of the GameStop scandal, was asking me, well, why do so many rules that influence corporations come from these private actors? So a lot of corporate governance is coming from these extra legal sources. And if you take a look at the rules that come from stock exchanges, stock indices, proxy advisors, they're all pushing corporations to focus solely on shareholder wealth maximization. And the weirdest example of this is ratings agencies. So, ratings agencies rate companies and their securities on a scale in exchange for a fee. And all three major ratings providers, Moody's, Fitch, and S&P, they all use these good governance criteria in their ratings models. And a principal factor is the extent to which the company protects shareholder rights and aligns, management with shareholder interests. And this is surprising in light of the fact that we think, creditor and shareholder interests often diverge. And I think it really shows how deeply linked good governance is with the concept of accountability to shareholders. Okay, so the last component here is culture, which I think is very interesting and also very difficult to pin down. So we divide this category into professional education, media, and politics. And I think, again, not going to touch on all of these, happy to talk about them in the Q&A, just going to hum a few bars about the political category, which I think is very interesting because we're seeing some shift here. So historically, shareholder primacy has had its roots in right of center thinking. Stakeholder models have been embraced by politicians on the left. And in the past several decades, we've seen convergence by both groups on shareholder primacy. And there's a few reasons for this. So one is that we've seen pension funds beginning to use their governance power to advance their political interests, which is encouraging these left of center politicians to embrace the expansion of shareholder rights. And there's been a major shift in retirement accounts from defined benefit to defined contribution plans that has rendered millions of working Americans forced investors in the stock market, which makes it a particularly risky move to challenge shareholder value creation because it's affecting millions of Americans who are investors through their 401ks. And we've also seen, after some pretty big crises, after the Enron accounting scandal, the financial crisis of 2008, these all sparked criticism of ineffective monitoring mechanisms, and people blamed a lack of managerial accountability, and so this induced this sort of bipartisan support in favor of reforms that would strengthen shareholder voice. Okay, so that's the corporate governance machine. It's law, culture, and markets. And now let's talk a little bit about how it works. So we've got three examples of where we can see the corporate governance machine working. One is if we see how public company boards have become homogenized over the past few decades. One is benefit corporations and how they were pushed to their own separate form of incorporation. And there's also the ESG movement. This is the one I'm going to spend some time on right now. So in the 50s and 60s, before we had this agency cost view of corporate governance, there was corporate social responsibility or CSR. And this was often framed in moral terms, totally unlinked from shareholder value. So the thought was that corporations have an obligation to engage in social responsibility because this is the right thing to do. It's nothing to do with shareholders. So in the 80s, where we see these shifts taking place, CSR models began to rely on a link between CSR and financial performance. And by the 2000s, we see this reworking. So CR is recast as value-oriented ESG. And this happened at a UN conference that brought together institutional investors, financial analysts, consultants, and regulators, and it was called Who Cares Wins. And in this moment, we see again, ESG is born. It's value creating environmental and social and governance initiatives. And this reframing caused it to hit the mainstream. So, for a few reasons here, you can see that the talking about this in terms of shareholder value was consistent with the law in Delaware, which meant that legal actors and fiduciaries and scholars could all embrace it. Market players also realize, well, hey, if this is good for investors, well, this is a business opportunity for us. We can supply metrics, we can supply other services for a fee that are going to help companies report on these different dimensions and help investors evaluate them. So, and I think this example really shows how the corporate governance machine took a concept that was completely unlinked from shareholders, and through law, markets, and culture, reshaped it and enabled it to hit the mainstream. Okay, so that's the corporate governance machine. That's how it works. And now let's pause and think about, what do we think of this machine, and what does it tell us about the future of corporate governance? So the normative conclusions that you will draw really depend on your perspective. So if you are a person that thinks shareholder empowerment is very important and you like this agency cost model, you're going to like the machine. You're going to like its pro-shareholder orientation. If you're an advocate of stakeholder governance, of course, this will be a less positive takeaway for you. But we think even shareholder empowerment folks have reasons to be concerned about the corporate governance machine. And one of the reasons here is that, one of the strong arguments in favor of shareholder primacy is that it's developed through private ordering. So you get sophisticated individuals who are organizing their behavior to do what's optimal. And we see them continuing to bargain for shareholder empowerment. That must mean that it's really the best state of affairs. So we're showing, I think, that this result is not the product of arm's length bargaining, and that instead we're getting path dependence in corporate governance that's restricting the range of options that are available that firms can freely adopt. So this is limiting that enabling nature of corporate law that everybody champions as being welfare maximizing. So that's one potential problem here. We're also concerned about the proliferation of one-size-fits-all governance models that may erode firm value when they're imposed on vastly different firms. We think that's one additional implication here from the existence of this corporate governance system. And there's also, I think, a real risk of hampering innovation in corporate governance that could be value maximizing. So those are reasons perhaps to be concerned about the existence of this corporate governance machine. And if you're not in favor of the shareholder primacy model, you're hoping for a shift to a new paradigm in the United States, of course, your view of this is much less rosy. And I think it's clear that as this shareholder primacy viewpoint has become enmeshed in our cultural and institutional understanding of good governance, and as we've seen these powerful players emerge to operate as gatekeepers, it's become really difficult to move to another paradigm, as a lot of people hope to do. And we think ultimately, without a big shock to the system, such as a federal chartering requirement directing companies to adopt a stakeholder governance model or something like that, without a big shock like that, we're not going to see stakeholderism dethrone shareholder primacy as the dominant framework in the United States. What we may see instead is that stakeholderism will continue to shape the practice of shareholder primacy. So you can see this playing out in that ESG example. Stakeholder governance advocates are co-opting the practice of shareholder primacy by saying, hey, well, if you want to maximize shareholder wealth over the long term, you have to consider stakeholders. ESG is important for shareholder wealth. And there's also been this evolution in, how do we think about shareholder value? Maybe we should remember that shareholders are individuals with diverse preferences. They breathe air, they hold jobs. And because these enlightened shareholder primacy perspectives incorporate stakeholder interests into shareholderism, and more cynically, they also provide some business opportunities for the market players, we think they're likely to make it through the corporate governance machine. So there are additional implications that can be drawn for other debates in corporate law, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and cede the floor to the distinguished commentators.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. A fascinating paper and fascinating presentation. Sue, Do you want to take over?
Sure, I will. I didn't put any slides together just in the interest of sticking to my, 5 to 7 minute slot. I really appreciate the invitation to serve as a discussant in today's seminar, and I really enjoyed reading your paper and engaging with the issues that you raise about the influence of what you call the American corporate governance machine on the likelihood of a paradigm shift away from shareholder primacy and towards a more stakeholder-oriented model of corporate governance and purpose. For the past few years, I've been working on the topic of corporate purpose, which I find absolutely fascinating, especially when you look at the lengthy history that it's had and some of the debates that were taking place during the interwar years and the way they resonate with what's going on right now. I've also written a book with Simon Deacon, Mark Favard Davies, and Frank Wilkinson entitled Labor, Finance, and Inequality, the Insecurity Cycle in British Public Policy. And in it, we examine the paradigm shifts that have taken place in British public policy since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, in order to explore the question of what might be required for a paradigm shift today. So your paper touches on a number of topics that I'm really interested in, although I've been looking at them. I'm not a legal scholar. My background is political economy. And but anyway, I really have gotten a lot out of your paper and enjoyed thinking about how I was going to present my comments today. I noticed that you acknowledge Bill Bratton in your paper, and I don't know whether you've read his 2008 paper with Michael Wachter called Shareholder Primacy's Corporatist Origins. But in it, they argue that the famous Beryl-Dodd debate of the early 1930s has been widely misread by contemporary readers who don't understand the political context of the New Deal. And they argue that without understanding that, it's easy to interpret Beryl as promoting shareholder primacy as we understand it today, and Dodd promoting CSR. In fact, I believed that too until I started reading a lot of the things that Bill has written about this, and I'm completely persuaded by the arguments that he's making in this paper, and he's made it in a number of other places too. What they argue, what Bratton and Wachter argue, is that in reality, Beryl, who was a member of Roosevelt's Brain Trust, was an advocate of government oversight of the industrial planning process under the New Deal, and was advocating bringing both labor and industry to the bargaining table. By contrast, they argue that Dodd was on the other side of the debate with the industrialists, who were opposed to government regulation and instead wanted authority for running the American economy to be allocated to the managers of very, very large American corporations at the time. Now, I think this debate, and particularly Dodd's position in it, which isn't well known, has a lot of resonance with the current debate in which the likes of BlackRock's Larry Fink, starting with his 2018 annual letter to CEOs, and the US Business Roundtable in its 2019 statement on the purpose of the corporation, seem to be trying to take control of the narrative on corporate purpose. And while they're calling on corporations to prioritize purpose, their narrative still supports the idea that this will also benefit corporate profits and the financial interests of shareholders. And I think this provides really strong support for your argument about the American corporate governance machine and the way that we'll only probably see any move towards a more stakeholder-oriented model of corporate governance and purpose if we frame it in terms of also being in the benefit of the financial interests of shareholders. Now in Britain, we've got somewhat of a different approach going on. Since 2015, for example, Will Hutton, and he's a colleague of mine on the Council for the Progressive Economy Forum, and Claire Chapman, who was at the time a director of BT, have engaged with leading UK companies through the Purposeful Company initiative. And what they've been doing is gathering evidence that corporate purpose adds value, issuing guidance on how to put it into practice, and pressing for changes in policy, regulation, and law. And one outcome that we've already seen is the change in the 2019 Corporate Governance Code, which requires all companies with a premium listing to report on corporate purpose. The Purposeful Companies narrative is also very different from that of BlackRock and the Business Roundtable and those sorts, For example, it argues that business exists to pursue a purpose that benefits society. And in its 2020 response to the government's post-pandemic economic growth inquiry, it argued that rather than having profit as the end goal for business, creating value for society is the end goal. Now, as yet, it's unclear whether this represents, on the part of those involved, a genuine commitment to change with the potential to produce a shift in corporate purpose and corporate governance, akin to the one that followed the Second World War. I don't know what's been happening in the States, but in Britain, I've been really interested in following, and it's these examples, you've really got to dig for them. They're not in the mass media, but really interested in seeing the kinds of responses that have come from business in response to the crisis of the COVID pandemic, and especially in relation to supporting the NHS. So around a year ago, for example, when the NHS's privatized global supply chain broke down, the government sent out a call to manufacturing companies for a major boost in medical supplies, and many companies responded. And what happened was teams of highly skilled people and organizations made themselves available to design and manufacture new products, such as ventilators and breathing equipment, but also PPE for NHS staff. And in this context, there was cooperation between large and small manufacturers, universities, UCL is one of them, medical companies, and even Formula One motor racing teams because of their ability to very rapidly design and produce prototypes. And they came together usually through the network that was first established at the university. So people were at university together, they knew each other. And so these networks sort of came together very quickly. And the production began within weeks, if not days, for these needed supplies. This was all on a not-for-profit basis. And most of the designs were made available open source online so that others anywhere in the world who were trying to deal with the pandemic and needing these sorts of supplies that were required could make use of them free of charge. Now, it remains to be seen how this experience, if at all, will change the way business is conducted, or indeed who will benefit. But I think the current interest in and evidence of businesses assuming a social and public purpose, and in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, cooperating to deliver it, may be reason for optimism, at least here in the UK, where the corporate governance machine isn't nearly as well entrenched as it is in America. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, or because I don't know what's been going on in America, but about the American experience of the COVID crisis, because I've read some of Gerald Davis's work recently. I wrote a paper on corporate purpose, and one of the reviewers directed me to a whole load of American literature that I'd completely missed. But he looks at the question of, I mean, he's got a book called The Decline or the Vanishing American Corporation. And so one of the silver linings that he sees as coming out of sort of that phenomenon and the development of what he calls platform capitalism is the possibility of relocalizing lots of things. So, what's to keep workers from, drivers from forming a collective and using the same technology Uber does, but in a way that benefits them in the local community. So I'm just wondering if in response to this crisis, there's any evidence at all in America of the kinds of maybe silver linings, just to use Gerald Davis's term, like what we've seen here in the UK. And again, we don't know if this is going to continue here. It may just have been a response to the crisis and then things will go back to the way they were. But I like to think that maybe there will be some sort of positive outcome from the tragedy of this pandemic that we've all lived through for over a year now. So with that, I'll stop. But thanks very much. Really enjoyed your paper.
Thanks very much, Sue. Not sure about how sustainable the silver lining in the UK really is. At least if you look at it in terms of legal change, there hasn't really been much hard legal change so far, I think, but it remains to be seen. But let's hand over to Georg. and see what his comments are, please.
Yes, thank you, Carsten, and thanks for Dorothy and Elizabeth for a great paper. I just wanted to start out by summarizing the main points again. So the main claim is that there is a deeply ingrained pattern, namely the shall orientation in US corporate governance. And I found very intriguing how the authors trace the historical development of corporate governance from the original purpose of being something in the public interest to be hijacked, essentially, for pure shareholder value maximization tool. And interestingly, the authors then also show that any new reforms that are being successful must be necessarily framed in order to be successful as being pro-investor. And the key example here is that ESG was only able to be widespreadly adopted because it was framed, it was sort of recycling the old corporate social responsibility movement framed as a pro-investor tool. And overall, the paper argues that this is largely a negative trend because, for example, it does not allow for experimentation. It's the sort of one-size-fits-all approach, which is a negative trend for corporate America. So much about the summary. I wanted to really congratulate to the authors for this excellent paper. I thought it's a fascinating contribution to the current debate on corporate purpose, seen from a completely different angle. So the many other purpose papers that you read are really looking just at the purpose and what it is and what it does and should it be, and this really looks at the system as a whole, and it's a very powerful critique of the system as a whole. And it shows that it's not just the law, and it's not just the investors, and it's not just one single thing, but it's so deeply ingrained into everything that and then actually law may be the least important, I think you argue, right, that so many other players around that it's very hard to change anything. And the case studies are interesting in showing that there's this move from CSR to ESG and the emergence of the benefit corporation, and it ultimately provides a recipe for anybody who wants to be successful in changing corporate America, how you have to pitch it. You just have to tell that it's good for shareholders, and then everything will be successful, right? That's the upshot at the end. I really enjoyed that. But my job here is not just to praise the paper, but I also need to be a little provocative and playing a little bit, devil's advocate, and put some questions to you, maybe to start a discussion on a deeper reflection on some of the points that you're making. So one of the questions that I had is the following: is the US framework really so strongly pro-shareholder, as you claim? Right? And in particular, seen from an international perspective, that may not be the case. We sometimes in Europe see the US as being extremely pro-director oriented, in comparison particularly to the UK system, which is probably even more shareholder oriented than the US. The American system is sometimes seen as something where the directors, with a very powerful lobby organization, telling corporations what to do, relocating to Delaware, and all of these things hold a very firm grip on what corporations do and how they should do it. Examples you also discuss are the poison pill, which you argue, I think, is no longer so strongly in operation, but is always there and can be quickly adopted, right, at very short notice. Then difficulties for shareholders to gain access to proxies. In comparison to Europe, that is definitely much easier in Europe for shareholders to put something to a shareholder vote, to put things on the agenda of general meetings, for example, to nominate directors and all of these things. Then things like the business judgment rule, which gives some, I think, strong discretion to directors' decision-making, and staggered boards ultimately, which make it harder to get rid of directors in case of a change of control, are examples, I think, of this general director orientation, which may or may not always be the same as shareholder orientation. And then in my experience at least, I think there is a controversial dialogue on the merits of the shareholder orientation in America. And I don't really see this sort of machine which is just really operating into one direction. I mean, there is a serious critique from all sides. There is vibrant academia. There are the guys like Larry Fink and others who are seriously critiquing the system as it stands. So that would be basically question number one. The second question is asking, is the machine, even if it operates, is it really so bad? Because the underlying assumption of the paper, and maybe a bit of a weak spot, is put differently, that the big question I think here is shareholder value orientation really detrimental to social value? I mean, that's ultimately the key question that you're discussing here, right? And there are two interpretations of your machine as it is at work. One view could be, yes, it's evidence of sort of powerful incumbents in the American society with a powerful lobby organization who push for these changes. Or there could be a different view, which is saying, no, right, the machine is operating smoothly. It's true that there is a machine at work and it's pushing for shareholder value, but it's a result of efficient market operation here, that lawmakers are doing everything they can in order to promote economic growth. Investors are pushing for value creation. Business schools are doing, in the culture context, business schools are doing everything in order to educate the next generation of leaders to also continue the American success. So I guess what I'm saying is that the machine at work, it might just be that everybody is pushing for the right thing. It's not necessarily saying that the machine, the evidence that everybody's pushing for the same thing is not necessarily negative, right? So I think the observation that there is a machine at work on all levels is absolutely spot on, but that doesn't make it bad in itself, right? That's my main point. And as example for this, the move from CSR to ESG, I think is really a wonderful example in your paper. And the claim is here that CSR originally, corporate social responsibility originally was basically the moral thing, right? The non-profitable movement towards not necessarily profit making. And that got changed through the advent of ESG, which is basically the same thing, but under the pro-investor label. Yeah. And again, you could ask, what's so bad about promoting social standards, environmental standards, if it's also driven by investors? There is evidence that, common owners, for example, and also large institutional owners that are basically owning the entire society and a large pool of investee companies do increasingly care about the system as a whole, simply because they're invested everywhere, right? So it's in their intrinsic interest to care about those things out of pure self-motivation. That is true, but that may, again, not be necessarily a bad thing. And that sort of response then may be a good one, right? It may overcome the traditional investors that may sometimes be myopic, that may sometimes be pushing for pure idiosyncratic value. And this type of investment ownership that is driving for ESG promotion may be a very elegant solution, actually, for reconciling, on the one side, profit maximization, but also caring for the better things. And that leads me to the final or penultimate question, rather, on I would encourage you to think a little bit more about what would be the alternative scenario then in your view. I mean, I think you do a wonderful job in critiquing the machine at work and the shortcomings that you identified, but you only sketch, what would be then. Maybe that's something for your next paper. I don't know, what would be then the vision that you have on how it should be instead. And the common problem that is identified with broadening the purpose is that you would make corporations accountable towards well towards the question mark, right? I mean, that's the question. I mean, so the common complaint is always when boards have too many masters and are accountable to many different stakeholders and constituencies, it's very hard to identify a good strategy of what to do. And there is some experience in, I'm just putting here Germany, but Europe more generally, which I think has a more stakeholder orientation than the US, of some negative side effects here, right? That managers are sometimes using this as a powerful excuse for saying, oh, yeah, I was, at this last Wednesday, right, I was caring for the employees. The next day, of course, I was doing something for the customers. And so you can always do things, and you always find somebody you can name as a recipient of that activity. So in other words, it may be the perfect excuse for managers either to not do anything or to tunnel or to steal things from, or to engage in any other activity which is not necessarily value creation for anybody. It may also lead to deadlock situations in board decision makings, where different representatives from different groups in the board may fight for different things, and then the board cannot decide on anything, cannot agree on promoting anything. And the mission statement, which is something that is gaining support in France these days, has turned out and has been shown as a very powerful takeover defense. Again, a very useful, convenient excuse to exclude foreign investors from gaining access. Just as a side note, I think, because I mentioned Germany, the fact that Germany has employee representation on the board may be a much more important feature, I think, of the corporate governance system in Germany than this corporate purpose, which is pro-stakeholder. So I'm not convinced that this is necessarily the right way to go. Final thing, what about then the benefits of the shareholder approach? Shouldn't you maybe take them a little bit more into the focus in your study? Because, I mean, the traditional view, of course, is that a shareholder value approach is what humans like, right? I mean, the human being is ultimately interested in making a profit, and of course you need to control it, and this is what we as lawyers have always been doing, right? We need to control for externalities where bargaining, where negotiating does not work, where market failures exist. We must regulate and we must set limits. But ultimately, the shareholder value approach, I think, is most consistent with the mindset of investors. And given the choice between something that is giving you profit and something that is nice and saving the planet, but is not giving you profit, if squeezed, investors will always push for the former. True, I think there are many problems in the current model, and you identify them, that the current model may not be good for innovation, and particularly in situations of highly complex products where investors don't understand the product and put high pressure on management to deliver short-term benefits that are not consistent with the business model of the company. But all of these, I think, would something that could be addressed in the current system. Any change, any dramatic change towards a bigger purpose would, I think, warrant a cost-benefit analysis. And this is the key thing here, my argument here, that if you wanted to move to a broader corporate purpose, then you would sacrifice some of the advantages of the current system. And the shareholder value system does have many. I mean, I don't need to go through all of them, but the benefits of diversification, of allowing markets to be created, of diversification through fund managers, which brings value to many retail investors through investment funds, and so forth and so forth. So these are just a number of provocative questions that shouldn't distract the attention from the fact that I very, very much enjoyed this paper, and I find it a wonderful starting point for this discussion. And I hope my questions are sort of helping to frame the next half an hour or so. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Georg. Before we open it up, both commentators put a couple of questions to you, Dorothy. Would you like to take a few minutes to answer them?
I'd love to. And first, let me just say thank you again for those wonderful comments. And you've given us so many good things to think through, and I'm sure that I'll be following up with you both to discuss further. But I would love to touch on a few things here, and I'll go backwards. Just quickly for Georg's first question, is this really, are we right that this is really such a shareholder system that we have in the United States? So I think I would refer you to a paper by the former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, Leo Strine, called The Soviet Constitution Problem and Comparative Corporate Law, where he makes the argument that, a lot of people say, if you look at the paper rights in the European Union, you would say shareholders have a lot more power, but that's akin to looking at the Soviet Constitution and saying that it's a model of liberalism, because in practice, a lot of those rights aren't used. And when we look at the power of institutional investors and how they use their rights in the United States, we see that it really is a strong shareholder system. So I think that, many of the examples that you gave, the poison pill, proxy access, staggered boards, as a result of this working of the corporate governance machine, public companies can't use them. No public company, almost no public companies have, at least at the S&P 500, the largest, most prominent public companies lack staggered boards. They lack poison pills. Yes, there are shadow pills, but they're also limited in how they can use them based on what ISS and other proxy advisors say. They basically say you have to go to your shareholders before you do a poison pill. Proxy access is now available at most large public companies as a result of institutional investors who brought these bylaw amendments and successfully over the last 10 years. So I think that I feel strong about this one. I feel good, like we're right about the pro shareholders orientation in the United States. The normative questions are super interesting. Like, is this really so bad? What's the alternative? Maybe this is all good. I think it's outside of the scope of what we're doing in this project, and we kind of tease it in, so I can see why you want to talk about it, and it's certainly something we have to think about more and fodder for a future project here. I think all I want to say is that it doesn't seem like we've gotten here to this place of shareholderism because everybody's bargaining for it. Which is what the argument is, I think, that, oh, this is so great, everybody keeps choosing it, but it's not like that. There really is no other option. And I think that's our main point. It's path dependence. The point about ESG standards becoming standardized and being investor driven is interesting. I think, maybe it's not so bad. And again, this is where I'm going to be kind of hand wavy, but I think there are two things you could say, maybe just two implications that you could draw from this that maybe you wouldn't like. So one is that anything that's not measured and able to be studied and demonstrably shown to be linked to investor value gets left out. And we both, Elizabeth and I both think that we might see the evolution of ESG in the United States, at least, taking this sort of one size fits all approach to, again, it's the things that can be measured and scored, and that has some negative implications too. I just saw Dan Ariely was talking who's a professor at Duke, and he said that, well, there's this SHE index that scores companies based on how representative their boards of directors are, how many women sit on the boards. And if you look at the SHE index, high performance on the SHE index does not correlate with financial value. But if you look at other measures that are harder to score, so how well women are treated in the workforce, things like that are a little squishier, that actually correlates very strongly with value. So again, when we're saying that everything has to be done in this sort of investor-driven way, I think there's a question about things getting left behind, or companies being driven to one size one-size-fits-all solution here too. Okay, many other interesting points that and we need to give some more thought to. And Sue, I would love to hear more about your research about the paradigm shift, because this to us is fascinating. How do you get a paradigm shift? We think that it's hard now, given that this machine exists, but it's happened before. I mean, if you look in the United States, we moved from a world of managerialism to this shareholder primacy world. So how did that happen? How could it happen again? These are questions that we think are just fascinating, and would love to hear about your research into paradigm shifts. Hear more. Your questions about, is this going to change how business is conducted in the United States? I think my gut is, although we've seen some positive changes, and I actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times at the beginning of all of this with Leo Strine saying, this is a moment, businesses of America, take this moment and be better. And I think we've seen some positive things with regard to treatment of employees. And I think there's also a sense in which this crisis made people realize that, well, hey, climate change could bring about another crisis that's also would be as disruptive, if not more. So there's a moment, there's real energy around climate change, I think. I don't know that this is going to be lasting in the sense that it's going to disrupt the machine and all the things that orient people and companies and fiduciaries towards shareholders. I think that ultimately, as this plays out, the machine will win out. And again, could this have been a moment? What I think could really have disrupted this machine and thrown sand in the gears or whatever, is if we got some federal regulation, changing things along the lines of what Senator Warren wanted to do with the Accountable Capitalism Act. And this was another thing, at the beginning of the pandemic, Elizabeth and I were talking like, oh my gosh, is this going to be an inflection point where we get this big regulatory shock? And we haven't seen that. And actually, Stephen Bank and Brian Cheffins have a new paper that they talk about critical junctures in corporate law, and when we might see moments where regulation is more likely. And they ultimately conclude that the COVID pandemic is not a critical juncture, that we haven't seen the sustained fall in the stock market, and there isn't the sense that businesses were really responsible for this crisis, and that those two preconditions are necessary to see a big regulatory change. So I think that seems to be borne out thus far. And I'm seeing more questions come in, so I'm going to stop there and hear your thoughts and questions. Thank you.